Hello, welcome back to my fave fanfics. Here, I post, well, my favorite fanfictions, if that wasn't obvious. I do hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do. Please like and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get started.
Welcome, my dear faves, to the first part of What If Female Naruto Was the Older Sister to the Elric Brothers. Credit goes to Blood Pokemon 101 for this fantastic fanfic. Chapter 1. Bitter Departure. A boy with hair and eyes are bright as gold stared curiously at an older girl blonde tied into short pigtails and eyes as blue as the ocean's depth. Ed. Look. This is your new big sister, Naruko. His mom announced, cheerily. Edward stared at the older girl, his sister, with wonder and awe. With chubby legs, he toddled towards her. Hi, sister. He greeted, toothily. I'm Edward. Quote. The girl smiled, widely at him. Nice to meet you, Edward. I'm Naruko. She greeted in return, gently rubbing his head. Ed stood nervously as his mother searched for a nice pair of clothes to wear. They were going to take a family photo, she had told him, whatever that meant. Naruko was already dressed in a pale blue summer dress. Her blonde hair was tied into their usual pigtails. After he was neatly dressed in a burnt red shirt and brown shorts, his mom went to get his infant baby brother, Alphonse, ready as well. His big sister grabbed his smaller hands and followed after their mother as she led them into a room where Dad was along with a strange man with a camera. He couldn't understand a word his parents were saying, but his could, seeing as her face was scrunched up in confusion. Ed was picked up by Trisha as she held him out towards Hohenheim. His father tentatively placed his hands around his small waist as if he feared dropping him by accident. Edward let out a large, childish grin. He couldn't remember the last time his father held him. His whole body trembled with childlike joy. Who could blame him? He couldn't remember the last time his father picked him up, even if his grip was uneasy and unsure. His sister crawled onto their father's shoulder while their mother tenderly held their infant baby brother. They were one big, happy blonde family. All smiles and sunshine with no worry in the world as the photographer took their family picture. At least, that's what Ed thought. Now a little bigger, Edward and Alphonse sadly and dejectedly stood outside of the cracked door of their father's study watching the man on the desk, focusing on his research. Ever since their family photo, Hohenheim has been crammed inside his study reading those books of his. Ed and Al never understood why. Why won't Daddy play with them anymore? What was he doing that was so important that he would isolate himself in his room? Trisha and Naruko had left to go someplace, leaving the boys alone with their father. The boys were feeling extremely agitated and bored. When was their mother going to bring big sister back, so she could play with them? Edward may be only 4, but he was more perceptive than most kids his age. His sister was starting to act strangely. There was nothing noticeable about her, but she seemed more tense and sad for some reason. He wondered if it was because Dad was no longer with them. That bastard walked out on them almost a year ago. He noticed how much Hohenheim's absence has affected their mother. Trisha tries to act like nothing was wrong, trying to strong for her kids, but they knew she was a little heartbroken from her husband's disappearance. Edward would never forgive his father for leaving them. Hurting him was one thing, but hurting his mother was another. He hated the sad look on his mother's face. So it wasn't after their father walked out on them that Ed and Al tried to study alchemy. They were hoping to find the reason for why he left, and also keep their mother happy. He remembered the first time he and Alphonse performed it. His mother smiled brightly, showering them with praises. Naruko tried to see if she could do alchemy as well, but it was too complicated for her to understand. Although, she was a bit jealous that her two younger brothers could do something so cool that she couldn't be any prouder of them. Now it was Edward's turn to be worried about her. Through the cracked door of her room, he could see his sister staring sadly off into space. Peeking in further, he could see Naruko was actually staring at the small wooden horse he and Al alchemically made for her last birthday present. He remembered how happy and proud she was of them because of how much their alchemy improved in just a few months, slobbering them with kisses and hugs, much to Alphonse's delight, while Edward groaned in disgust yet secretly happy. He frowned. So, why? Why was she crying while staring at it? It both shocked and hurt Edward to see the shimmer of barely controlled tears in his sister's blue orbs, sticking against her long eyelashes. It was rare for her to cry. His sister never cries, even when she broke her ankle when she fell off the tree that time after helping their mother pick some apples for her apple pie later that night. Why was she crying now? Did she not like wooden horse, after all? The door squeaked louder as Ed tried to shove himself closer. The noise the door made caused Naruko to whip her head around to see her little brother standing there, a look of confusion, worry, anger glowing in his golden eyes. She knew where that anger was directed at. Their father. She knew about the bitter resentment Edward held for Hohenheim for leaving them and causing a small painful rift in their family. Ed. Naruko spoke, questionably. What are you doing in my room? You should be in bed. She hopped out of her bed, clad in yellow pajamas, rushing towards him. Sister, why are you crying? Edward asked, skipping straight to the point. He charges it headfirst at the center of his concerns, no sense of tact at his young age. Golden eyes stared into his big sister's own blue ones, face twisting into one worry-driven confusion and painstaking sadness. Naruko blinked once then twice before her face contorted into a wide smile. Did I worry you, Ed? She asked, cheekily. Sorry about that. She affectionately rubbed his head. Edward frowned even more. He knew his sister was deliberately avoiding his question. He clenched his small fist. Is it Dad? He growled, lowly. Blonde brows rose in confusion. Huh? She said, dumbly. Her younger brother pushed away from her, his expression filled with rage and bitterness at the man who left them. Are you crying because Dad's gone? Quote. Naruko's expression disheartened slightly at the mere mention of their father. Watching Ed's face darken even more, she shook her head. Of course, she was somewhat saddened by Hohenheim's departure, but for some reason, she never held it against the man, not like her little brother did. Originally being orphaned, she was just have to have someone to call a father, even if it was a short while. The older blonde shook her head, vigorously. Ed, why do you hate Dad so much? Quote. Edward gritted his teeth, golden eyes gleaming with rage. The bastard ditch us. He yelled, furiously. Naruko frowned at that. She could perfectly understand her younger brother's bitterness towards their absent father, but having an absent dad was better than having no dad at all. At least, Hohenheim was alive somewhere. Ed watched as his sister gently stroked his cheek, blue eyes softened. Ed, you shouldn't be angry at Dad all the time, she advised, softly. Why shouldn't I? He argued, heatedly. He doesn't care about us. His whole body shook, golden eyes glancing at the floor, pain and sadness reflecting in them. He doesn't love us, he mumbled out, dejectedly. Seeing how hurt her brother was, Naruko pulled him into a hug, softly stroking the back of his head in a soothing manner. "Edward, father didn't leave because he hates us, Dadbeo. I'm sure dad loves us, cherishes us." The Uzumaki would never forget the heartbroken expression Hohenheim wore as he walked out the door, suitcase in hand. "I'm pretty sure dad didn't really want to leave us," she continued. "Then why did he?" Edward's pained voice was muffled by her shirt. Sadly, Naruko couldn't answer that because she doesn't know the reason for their father's disappearance. She didn't know what to say to justify it, or even if she should justify a man leaving his wife and kids behind. There was only one thing she could say. "Remember, Ed, no matter what, Dad had always and would always love us. Bonds aren't destroyed that easily. I'm pretty sure Mom and Dad love each other very much." He pulled away from her slightly, desperately staring into her eyes. "Then why does Mom get sad whenever Dad's name is brought up?" he asked, pleadingly, silently waiting for his sister's answer. There was short pause as Naruko contemplated her answer. Her blue eyes drifted out towards the window, staring at the moonlit night. She swallowed a thick lump in her throat, her heart twisting painfully in her chest. "Sometimes, dear little brother, sometimes love is painful. Sometimes a person has to make sacrifices because they love someone and hold them very dear to their heart. And if you could overcome that agonizing pain, then you know that your love is real." Edward didn't realize at that moment that Naruko wasn't just speaking about their father, but about herself as well. Childishly oblivious to his older sister's soon-to-be departure. "Ow!" Edward squeaked out, painfully as he was hit by a wench. He glared up at his blonde-haired friend. "What was that for, Winry?" Quote. Winry huffed. "Stop acting like such a jerk, you alchemy freak." Quote. Naruko shook her head in amusement as her younger brother and friend argue, heatedly. Alphonse clutched the back of her blue shirt, watching them both wary, gold eyes. This simple fight of many started because Winry wanted Naruko to braid her hair. Edward sneered at the request with disgust at doing something so girly, and jealousy at the young blonde preoccupying his older sibling's time. Naruko mused at that. Edward had always been jealous of anyone grabbing her attention away from him, even Winry and Alphonse. She remembered fondly at how Ed would angrily pout when Al scraped his knee, forcing his sister to tend wounds while Mother was busy making dinner, completely unaware. He even went as far as to deliberately injure himself, so her attention would be drawn from Al to Ed. The oldest blonde sibling had felt an extreme sense of happiness at how much Ed and Al adored her. Always begging, pleading for their sister to play with them whenever she wasn't busy helping Mom with chores. It was so favorably different from the blank, unfeeling stares she used to get her orphanage. Naruko was snapped out of her musings when Winry struck Edward on the head with another, indignantly calling him a stupid jerk. She wholeheartedly loved her adopted family. She wouldn't trade them for anything else in the world. Edward and Alphonse stood out the kitchen doorway, scared and worried. Their sister was in the other side talking with Mom. They couldn't make out the words that were being said, but sounds of distraught, hurt, and terror were clear. "Brother, what do you think sister is talking about with Mom?" Al asked, nervously. Ed shook his head, sadly. "I don't know, Al." He was frightfully worried. What was Mom discussing with their sister about that she needed to rush him and Al into bed early just so they wouldn't hear? Did you think it has something to do with why Mom leaves with sister sometimes? His little brother's trembling voice broke Edward out of his depressive thoughts. "Where do you think they go, Al?" Ed asked, his younger brother. The boy of 4 pondered this immediately. It has been somewhere really secretive and girly if Mom can't bring us, Al concluded. Ed bletched at that. Well, if Mom wants to spend some girl time with Big Sister, then we shouldn't stop her, he answered, phrasing his words with much more tact than he would discussing about Winry than with Trisha. Edward and Alphonse jumped slightly in surprise as the kitchen door swung open to reveal a terror-stricken Naruko. Fretful and distressed, Ed and Al rushed to her side. "Sister, what's wrong?" Quote. "Why are you crying?" Quote. Hearing her brother's distraught and worried voices, Naruko bit the inside of her lips to keep herself from breaking down in front of them. "Ed. Al. There's something I have to tell you," Naruko spoke, quietly. She couldn't stop herself from trembling, her voice hoarse from her non-stop crying. "What is it?" her 2 younger brothers asked, eager and scared. "Does it have something to do with why their sister was crying?" She mumbled something quietly under her breath. So quiet that Ed and Al couldn't hear. "Huh?" Twin pair of blonde brows furrowed in confusion, trying to strain their ears to hear sister's barely contained voice. 2 words broke the boys. "I'm leaving." Naruko was packed and ready to go, despairingly ready to leave her family and return to her place of birth for who knows how long. She was spotted by an upset Alphonse. The look of heartbreak on his face was truly agonizing. Small padded feet rushed towards her, hand clinging desperately at her shirt. "Please, Big Sister. Don't go." Alphonse sobbed. The older blonde shook her head, soberly. "I can't." "Why? Do you really have to leave?" Quote. "Sorry, Al," Naruko replied, softly, trying to remain strong. "But I really have to go." She gave him a reassuring smile. "I promise to come back someday. Don't even bother." A different furious voice rang out. Both Naruko and Alphonse turned their heads to see Edward standing there in the hallway, little hands balled into angrily trembling fists. "We don't need you. You're abandoning us just like Dad did." Quote. Al gasped at the harshness of Ed's declaration. "Ed!" he cried out in disbelief. Naruko smiled, bitterly. She was expecting this sort of hostility from Edward. While Al had been pleading non-stop for her to stay, Ed had been avoiding her all week, sending her an occasional enraged and resentful glare every time their paths crossed. It broke her heart to see her dear little brother who absolutely adored her suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. She reached out towards him and softly and affectionately patted his head like she used to do. But instead of the usual happy grin she always received, a vicious growl erupted from Edward's throat as he angrily slapped her hand away as if it was contaminated. "Stop it. Just leave already." Quote. Blue eyes saddened immensely when Ed furiously refused to look at her. Naruko sighed dejectedly. She grabbed her bag and headed out the door, ignoring Al's cries and pleads for her not to leave. Closing the door behind her, Naruko finally let out the silent, depressive sobs she was desperately holding in. Chapter 2. The Fullmetal Sister. "Ah. It's been so long since I set foot here." Quote. A woman with long, blonde hair with pieces braided on both sides of her face that led into a neat bun with her bangs framing her face stepped onto the Resembool train platform. She had a slightly tanned complexion, striking blue eyes, and pair of whisker-like birthmarks on each side of her smooth, flawless face. She wore an orange jacket with a white sash belt tied around the waist. It had stripes of black around the hems, sleeves, and waistline. She sported a black, slitted, short skirt and a pair black leggings underneath, and a pair of short-heeled, black sandals adorned her feet. She yawned and stretched her aching limbs. As much as she missed train rides, sitting on one spot for days on end could really tighten the muscles, especially since she's used to constant daily physical activities. The young woman smiled to herself. I wonder how Ed, Al, and Winry are doing. Her expression saddened a bit, remembering the last time she ever stepped foot in Resembool. She slapped her cheeks together to perk herself up. No use of getting depressed over old memories. Time to hit the road. Winry, a young blonde girl of 16, was cleaning up the mess of her workshop. She had to do 3-day rush hour job for Ed's automail because the stupid fool went and broke his. It's always so lively when those two are here, Winry mused, smiling fondly to herself. Her face then contorted into a small frown. Every time she thought about Edward and Alphonse and everything they are going through to just be normal again, a huge pang of sadness gripped her heart. Those boys have lost their entire family. In only a span of a few years. Their father left them, their older sister disappeared on them, saying there was somewhere she needed to be, and their mother died of illness. All they had left was each other. It was truly saddening. Winry wiped away the tears that were threatening to spill out. She snapped herself out of her upsetting thoughts when she heard Den's happy barks. Something good must have caught her attention. She walked outside her workshop and went towards the front door. What is it, Den? She asked her pet, knowing that the dog won't respond to her. But what she saw made her blue eyes widen in disbelief, tears threatening to pour out. An overwhelming sense of nostalgia and happiness swelled inside her, so much so that it was on the brink of bursting into a swirling volcano of hopeful ecstasy and coveted, blossoming warmth. Naruko! Exclamation mark. Winry's voice trembled, the uncertainty could be felt from miles away. The aforementioned woman was being smothered with kisses, courtesy of an overjoyed Den. When the older girl heard her name, she turned her gaze towards the mechanic and waved her hand, enthusiastically. Yo, Winry! Long time no see, Datbeo. Quote. Winry felt like her heart was going to burst. It really was her. Naruko was back. Oh, Datbeo. I missed your cooking so much, Granny. Naruko shouted, happily as she scarfed down a plate of spaghetti and meatballs. It's here for you anytime, Naruko, Granny Pinako replied with a faint, nostalgic smile. The blonde woman nodded her head, still diligently slurping on the noodles. Winry took the time to stare at her long-lost friend. It's been over 10 years since she's last seen the girl. She took in her appearance and clothing. The clothes Naruko wore pretty casual while have their own, Naruko, taste. Hint, hint. The orange coloring. Even though, they weren't far off from being clothes that could pass in a mistress, but they also some sort of foreign taste to it. Though, the blonde mechanic could definitely see how much Naruko's body had grown. She had a very well-endowed and curvaceous figure. Athletic and slim. The body of a mature, tomboyish woman, unlike her brash childlike self of the past. As Winry was watching her, Naruko was busy analyzing the girl's features from the corner of her eyes. The crybaby that used to follow her around sure did turn out to be a passionate, confident young woman. She also really filled out quite nicely in some places. Not as much as her, but still enough to be called a lovely young girl. So, Naruko. Quote. Naruko hummed a bit before turning her attention towards Winry. The younger girl's sharp gaze told her that she was about to ask her a serious question. 100% likely to be why she left all those years ago. And there was no way she's leaving out of this one. Where were you? The blonde mechanic asked, sternly. When you left all you said was that you had somewhere to be. The older woman let out a nervous chuckle while scratching the back of your head. Boy, how was she going to explain this? She couldn't say. She was dragged back home because of a demon fox dwelling inside, became a ninja, a deadly assassin, was chased around by an international criminal organization known as the Akatsuki, participated in a gruesome war and became recognized and famous as the heroine of the Fourth Great Ninja War all across the elemental continent, and dreams to becoming the leader of her hometown village, the Hokage, which is not that far off. She shook her head. No, she couldn't tell Winry that. The story would seem incredibly unrealistic and absurdly far-fetched. Plus, she didn't want to meet a wrench to the face. That's Ed's job. I had to return to my place of birth, Naruko finally answered. They didn't like that I left, even if I was just a baby. Then why didn't you ask for permission to stay with Ed and Al? Winry shot back, suspiciously. Damn. When did Winry get so sharp? Well, the elders of my hometown are very strict. Nobody is allowed to leave until they are 18. Half-truths are better than lies. Blue Eyes stared into Blue Eyes as the blonde mechanic contemplated her older friend's words. She slowly nodded her head, seeming to accept that explanation. The Uzumaki let out a sigh of relief. What happened to your hand? Quote. Naruko instantly froze at the question. She bit the inside of her lip, painful memories flooding. Why did Pinako have asked that question? She was hoping that both Granny and Winry would be too unwilling to pry into her personal life to ask why her right hand was covered in bandages, for fear of upsetting her after being away for so long. Naruko was unable to respond. What the hell could she say? Exclamation mark. She couldn't say she had fight with her rival turned best friend turned evil to decide the fate of world. And the battle ended up costing both their arms as a tragic yet lucky result. I was in an accident, she half lied. Don't worry, it's nothing serious. Winry and Pinako didn't believe her for a second, but decided to let it slide. For now. Are you planning to visit your younger brothers? Pinako opted to change the topic. Oh, yes. Datbeo. Naruko beamed, fondly. I haven't seen them since they were little kids following me around everywhere. I wonder how those two idiot brothers of mine are doing. Quote. They are probably in Central now, Pinako answered her, taking a smoke out her pipe. They said something about doing some research at the library. She huffed out a small smoke, eyes grazing critically at Naruko. They tend to travel around a lot. Something flickered in Naruko's blue eyes. A fluid of emotions akin to guilt, hurt, and sadness. Yeah, I heard. On her way here, Naruko heard rumors about the famous Fullmetal Alchemist, hero of the people, Elric Brothers, whatever people wanted to call them. She wasn't interested in rumors like that. What she was most curious about was the description of the two boys. Two brothers, but one had automale limbs and the other was dressed in a giant suit of armor. That's the whole point of why I came here, the Uzumaki said, admittedly. It's been 10 years since I've last seen Ed and Al. I just want to see how they are doing. She sheepishly rubbed the back of her head. Although, I have no idea what to say to them, or even what to do when I see them. Naruko knew Edward was furious with her for walking out on them, just like their father. It's not like she had a choice in the matter. Like her brothers, she didn't know why she had to return back to her village. It wasn't until a few years later that she found out why the elders were so adamant about her return. She was the Jinchuriki of Kurama, the nine-tailed fox. The Uzumaki clenched her hand over her stomach. Those first few years living back in Konoha were a living nightmare filled with pain and loneliness. It hurt even more to know what it was like to be cared for and loved, only for it to turn into resentment and hatred in just a few short days. She was so glad that she didn't bring Ed and Al with her. She didn't want them to suffer because of her. Thinking about the family and friends she had here, waiting for her return one day, helped her push through all the pain and agony. If not that, she would have turned rogue long ago. Naruko. Naruko. Quote. Huh. Naruko blinked her eyes and glanced over at Winry, who was looking at her with concern. Was she that lost in thought? Quote. What's wrong? Winry asked. You kind of space out there. Oh, I was just thinking about the last time I saw Edward and Alphonse, Naruko half lied. Our parting wasn't really the happiest. She gave a bittersweet. I mean, Al couldn't stop crying and Ed was so angry with me, he wouldn't speak to me at all. I want to see them, but I don't really expect them to forgive me. Naruko, the mechanic began, blue eyes shimmering with sympathy. The blonde older woman shook her head. I know, Datbeo. I was a lousy sister, leaving them like that. Her face then set into puzzled gaze. By the way, what happened to our house? When I went over there, everything was burnt to the ground. What happened? Quote. Both Pinako and Winry gave her saddened and regretful looks, which made Naruko's guilt worsen. Something happened while she was away. Something terribly tragic. Blue eyes narrowed with suspicion and anger. Something happened. Tell me. Simple words, but she said it with so much inner fury. If someone had hurt her dear little brothers, there was going to be hell to pay. Finally it was Pinako who spoke. I don't think it's our place to tell, she started, solemnly. But I would say this much, after you left Ed became a state alchemist. He and Al burnt down the house as symbol of their resolve not turn to back. A frown formed on the whiskered woman's face. That wasn't resolve. They were running away, she mumbled under her breath. Huh. What did you say, Naruko? Pinako asked, voicing her confusion. Naruko let out a lopsided grin, waving her hands in front of her. Nothing, Datbeo. Quote. The elder Rockbell stared at her for a few seconds then nodded her head, seeming to let it go. The Uzumaki let out a silent breath of relief before her face turned grin. She knew Granny Pinako and Winry were staying silent about Edward and Alphonse. They didn't tell her everything, but they did say was more than enough for to pick up on. Being a ninja, Naruko was keen on gathering information from what was and wasn't said. Although, she wasn't as sharp, perceptive, or have cunning deductive skills like Sasuke, Kakashi-sensei, or Shikamaru, she isn't that dim-witted either. Something happened to Ed and Al while she was away. Something terrifying enough to cause them to burn down their house and run away. Even worse, to make her younger brother join the Amestris military as a state alchemist. And now, Naruko knows her brother, she knows Ed. He had never once cared about the military when they were little. So why was he a state alchemist? Many scenarios raced through her head for the various reasons for why her little, hot-headed brother would join the army. The one reason that stuck out the most and seemed the most reasonable was because he was hoping to gain something out of it. The Uzumaki pursed her lips, pondering this for a moment. She had heard that state alchemists get access to top-secret research material that's unavailable to the public. However, she also didn't think that was enough to garner Edward's attention. Ed wasn't the type of person who mindlessly obey over some petty papers. Naruko felt a tinge of sadness, hurt, and guilt. Did her leaving really affected Edward and Alphonse that much? The stronger the love, the stronger the hate would be when that love is lost. That notion was something she learned growing up as a ninja. Almost every villain she encountered were motivated by their loss of love. Whether it'd be familial, platonic, or romantic love, it was all the same. Naruko held back a sigh. No use on dwelling on it. It is what it is. So, Naruko. Quote. The Uzumaki snapped out of her stifling musings to turn her attention towards Winry. When are you leaving? Winry asked, frowning. Naruko had to resist the urge to giggle as she saw a trickle of tears at the corner of her blue eyes. There's the crybaby Winry she used to know. The older blonde pondered this for a brief moment. I'll probably leave first thing in the morning. What? Exclamation mark. The mechanic exclaimed in disbelief. I haven't seen you in 10 years, and this is how you leave. God. You're worse than Ed and Al. Quote. The Uzumaki gave a sheepish laugh. I'm sorry, she responded, awkwardly. She tilted her head towards Pinako. Where's the bathroom? I'm going to go take a shower then visit Mom's grave afterwards. The elder Rockbell nodded her head before giving Naruko directions to the bathroom, which the blonde ninja graciously accepted. Naruko entered the bathroom and closed the door. Once locked, she headed over to the bathtub to get the water running. She stripped herself out of her clothes, pieces of articles falling on the floor one by one to slowly reveal the body of a beautiful, curvaceous woman. However, her body wasn't completely flawless, devoid of all blemishes or injury. First, there was her obvious bandaged right arm. Since there was nothing covering it, it revealed just how much of arm were wrapped in white bandages, and that was most of arm. The only skin that could be seen were the area her right shoulder. Even if one were to remove the white wrappings, they would see that it wasn't her arm at all. The skin was horribly pale white color in contrast to her normally slightly tanned one. Luckily, the wrappings were not that easy to remove as they were glued to her prosthetic arm with some sort of sealing jutsu. Makes the first Hokage's, Hashirama Senju, cells more controllable, so it doesn't easily overwhelm her. Another marking on her skin that stood out was fist-sized scar on the left side of her chest just above her breast. She sunk herself deeper in the water to hide the scar. A huge tinge of sadness and betrayal also tightens around her chest, her heart every time she looks at the wound. It was the same injury she received from Sasuke's Chidori during their first battle at the final valley during their preteen years. Although she managed to deflect the blow from her heart, it still hit her lung, damaging a vital organ. If it wasn't for Kurama, she would have been dead. Even so, even if Sasuke, throughout his years as a rogue ninja, had caused her a tremendous and heartbreaking amount of emotional and physical pain, she still couldn't bring herself to hate him. People would start to think she was some type of masochist, chasing after a guy that tried to kill her several times. But giving up on him was unacceptable. Sasuke was her best friend, someone she has an unbreakable bond with, someone who shares her pain of solitude. Giving up on him is no different than giving up on herself. I'll save Sasuke. Those are the words Naruko promised, words that she etched onto her soul. At first those words were simply spoken to her other teammate Sakura to help the pink-haired Kunoichi ease her pain. However, deep down, it was really meant to dull the pain her heart. The pain of betrayal and heartbreak that twisted painfully in her heart. 4 years, it took 4 years, a war, and a fight to the death to make the stupid Uchiha come back to his senses. Stupid Sasuke, Naruko grumbled as she got out of the tub and began drying herself with the towel. He's such an idiotic, hot-headed bastard thinking he could shoulder everything on his own. She let a happy smile grace her lips. At least, he's back. I wonder what he's doing now. Quote. After getting fully dressed, Naruko decided to visit her mother's grave with Den marching by her side. The blonde took the route with fewer people. She didn't want any of the locals to notice that she was here. She wished that she could just run across the trees and rooftops, but she couldn't. Not with Den happily paddling by her side. And Den was no ninja dog, not like Akamaru or Kakashi Sensei's summonings, so Naruko was just having to take a leisurely walk through the road, trying to as noticeable as possible. The blonde kunoichi finally made it to the cemetery. She walked through all the tombs, studying all the names until her blue eyes landed on specific one. Trisha Elric, 1878–1904. Beloved wife and mother. Naruko felt a series of different as she stared, dejected at the tomb before her. Regret, longing, sadness, and love. A small torrent of emotional current swirled around her. She heard from one of younger brother's letter that her foster mother died of illness. That was around the time Granny Tsunade was appointed as 5th Hokage. She wondered if she had snuck out and brought Trisha to the leaf, would Tsunade be able to cure her sickness? Then her mom wouldn't have died. She would have been able to reunite her now and see her beautiful smiling face along with teen versions of Edward and Alphonse now. Don't beat yourself over something that happened in the past, Naruko, Kurama's voice rang inside her mind. It's not like you could have prevented her death. Naruko frowned. But I could have brought her to the village to help her. And you think you would have been allowed to leave the village to someplace far away, especially the fact it's not even in the elemental nations. The fox replied back, sarcastically. The blonde kunoichi remained silent, knowing that the fox was right. With her status as a Jinchuriki, there's no way they would have let her leave the continent. It was because she was a Jinchuriki that she was forcibly brought back in the first place. Blue eyes glanced down at the tomb before her. She took a deep breath, and told her deceased adopted mother everything. She told her about her days in the academy and her rivalry with Sasuke and Iruka sensei. She spoke about how she ended up on the same team as him, another girl named Sakura Haruno who was infatuated with him, and a laid-back Jonin teacher, Kakashi Hatake, who was always late to their meetings and eventually became the 6th and current Hokage of the Hidden Leaf Village. Naruko discussed her first serious mission to escort a bridge builder, Zabuza and Haku, and how their mission changed everything for her. She told about the Chunin exams and the other Rookie 9, and how excited and anxious she felt to match up her strengths against other worthy contenders. Unfortunately, there was an attack on the village, so the rest of the exam was cancelled. After that, the blonde woman explained how she met Jiraiya, one of the 3 legendary Sannin, who was a super pervert but also really powerful and reliable. She ended up going on journey with him to meet Tsunade, another of the Sannin, so the older woman could become the 6th Hokage, since the 3rd Hokage was killed by Orochimaru, the last of the Sannin. Despairingly, she told a deceased Trisha about how she got into a really bad fight with Sasuke, and how, unbeknownst to her at the time because she was way too childish and naive, that Sasuke ran away from the village and became a rogue ninja to join up with Orochimaru. She tried hard to stop him, but all she was left with was a crushing defeat and broken heart. She voiced her regret about how she knew how alone he was, how she knew he was probably traumatized over the massacre of his entire family, but she just so jealous at the time. He was so good at everything he did. She admired him and declared he was her role model that she wanted surpass one day. If she wasn't so stupidly childish, Naruko would have seen the darkness growing inside Sasuke's heart day by day. She pretended she understood him, but, in reality, she didn't understand a single about him. She projected her own false image onto him, expecting him to live up to her expectations without worry. How stupid and selfish was she to just assume that everything would remain fine. Even Sakura knew that something was wrong with Sasuke before she even did. She was so very, very stupid. Naruko declared how she went on the 3-year-long training journey with Jiraiya to become strong enough to bring Sasuke back to the village and stand up against the Akatsuki, a group powerful S-class rogue ninjas, who are after Jinchuriki like her, people who house a tailed beast inside their body. She spoke about the sorrow and anguish she felt when Jiraiya died, her sage training, and Pain's attack on the leaf. Naruko detailed the overwhelming, breathless joy, exhilarating happiness, and all the pent-up sadness and turmoil she felt when finally met her birth parents, the 4th Hokage, Minato Namikaze, and his wife, Kushina Uzumaki. Well, their spirits anyway. After that, came the 4th Great Shinobi War. It was a war that decided the fate of the shinobi world. Lots of people, so many ninjas sacrificed their lives for the sake of the world. She told of pain and suffering she felt at seeing her comrades' deaths. But the confidence and happiness as she felt fighting by her friends was even more powerful. It was the reason she was able to keep going. And letting guys like Madara and Kagaya run freely was not an option. She couldn't let those fiends lay a hand on her little brothers. Naruko that there was soft tears streaming down her face as she told her deceased adopter mother about the many adventures she went. The pain and sorrow of feeling someone close to her suffer, the tragedy of war, and most of all, the joy and happiness she felt throughout her life as a ninja. When she was a little girl forcibly returning to the village, the blonde Uzumaki dreaded it with every fiber of her being. The cold glares, sneers of disgust, blatantly being ignored, a part often wondered how long it was before she snapped. And she would have too, if not for Iruka-sensei, and for that, she's forever grateful to her old academy teachers and his heartfelt, encouraging words. Den let out a low whine as she licked the tears away, causing Naruko to giggle slightly. "I'm okay, girl, I'm okay." The blonde woman softly patted the dog's head. "I guess seeing Mom again brought up some old feelings." She stood up on her legs, staring out into the distance. More precisely, at the house where she used to live with her adopted family. Or what was supposed to be her old family home. There was nothing broken woods and the scorched grassland around the area. "All right. Let's go see what my 2 little brothers were hiding." 5 minutes later, Naruko made it to the rumble of her old home. "Something smells suspicious, Naruko," Kurama spoke, cautiously. Naruko had to agree. She had ominous, foreboding sensation echoing the further she went into her home. Even Den's whines were an indicator that something gruesome and horrifying happened here while she was gone. The blonde kunoichi began moving and kicking away each rubble. The closer she got, the more the smell of decay and dried blood penetrated her nostrils. Her eyebrows furrowed as across the area of what seemed like dusty, white chalk of what she guessed of deformed transmutation circle with all the missing lines and faded designs and patterns. However, what got the Jinchuriki's attention were the blotches of dried caked blood all over the floor. It didn't take a genius to know that something horrific happened. Naruko bit the inside lip as a tinge of guilt pounded against her heart. The sense of decay was strong. Whatever her brothers did was buried underneath here. Especially since the ground had been dug up not too long ago. She let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding as she began digging away at the ground using wind chakra. Den tilted her head in confusion before trotted over to the spot Naruko was digging at. She gave it an experimental sniff before using her front paws to help remove the dirt. Naruko knew what that circle meant. She had hoped to high heaven that her brothers wouldn't do anything extremely crazy. Unfortunately, she could understand why Edward and Alphonse would to be tempted to perform the dreaded, forbidden human transmutation. Grief could drive the sanest to the darkest pits of despair and insanity. Sasuke is a prime example. He was a happy and quiet child before the slaughter of his family. The whole incident turned him to an extremely introverted, revenge-obsessed, international criminal. She could only hope that her brothers turned out a little better than Sasuke. The blonde kunoichi finally uncovered something. She used her bare hands to quickly remove the dirt from to get a better look. Her blue eyes lowered in sadness and regret. What she found was a piece of bone and a strand of black hair. Not brown. This was not Mom. Whoever this person was not Trisha Elric. Naruko bit her lips so hard that a trickle of blood started to flow out. She clutched the chest where her heart laid, as if trying to keep it from bursting from the raw ache she was feeling. Ed and Al have probably spent years figuring out human transmutation, only to realize all of their efforts were a total waste of time. Did they know what the maid was not Mom? Or did they flee in fright before confirming anything? She balled her hands into fists. If only she was here, if only she was here, as their big sister, she could have stopped them from making this mistake. Well, I'm off to see my idiot brothers, Naruko replied, happily. She was already packed and ready to board the train. I don't see you for 10 years, Naruko, and this is how you leave. Exclamation mark. Winry cried in frustration. The older blonde woman sheepishly rubbed the back of her head. I'm sorry. Quote. The blonde mechanic sighed. You really are worse than Ed and Al. I wanted to see Edward and Alphonse while they are still in Central, Naruko explained. Who knows where my wayward brothers wind up next? I'll miss my chance to see them. Quote. Both Winry and Pinako had anime sweat drops at the Naruko's dramatics. Well, don't try to destroy too much of Central, Pinako said with a smile. Don't forget to visit us sometime. Okay, Naruko. Winry proclaimed, tearfully. Naruko smiled, nostalgically. Now, there's the crybaby Winry she missed. She gave both the Rockbells a hug. Thanks for letting me stay. It was nice seeing again, Winry, Granny. You're welcome back anytime, Naruko, the elderly Rockbell replied. The blonde kunoichi removed herself and began boarding the train. Well, bye. She waved goodbye to them as they said their goodbyes back. Once they were out of sight, Naruko went to take her seat. Now, let's see what my two idiot brothers have been doing all these years. Chapter 3. Shattered Pedestal. Sister. Wait. A little Edward cried as he ran as fast as his stubby feet could take him. The darkness surrounding him was too great. No matter how hard he tried to catch up to his big sister, the distance between them gets bigger and bigger. Why? Why was his sister leaving him behind? Did he do something wrong? Was he bad? Sister, please. Ed wailed. Wait up. Don't leave me. Sister. Quote. Ed woke up with a start. He wiped away the sweat that were forming on his forehead, taking slow breaths to calm his accelerating heartbeats. Brother. Quote. Ed's golden eyes searched for the hollow-like voice of his younger brother, who's sitting against the wall on the far side of the bed he was sleeping on. Brother. Did you have a dream? Al asked him in a worried-filled tone. Yeah, Edward clenched his teeth in anger of who he was dreaming about. I was dreaming about her, he growled out, lowly. Alphonse didn't need to say anything. He instantly knew what he meant by her. He sighed and glanced out the window. It was a bright and sunny day. It's been over 10 years since they've last seen her. He could completely understand Ed's anger. Even he gets depressed at times at the mention of their sister. What do you want to do, brother? Alphonse asked, mainly hoping to take his older brother's mind off Naruko. Edward let out a frustrated while scratching the side of his head. There's nothing to do. Until Sheska finishes recreated drive. Marcos notes, we can't really do anything. They both sat in silence, contemplating on what to do. Well, I'm going to go find something to eat, the elder Elric spoke after a few moments. Ed didn't wait for his brother to speak as he leisurely climbed out the bed and headed towards the bathroom to take a quick shower. It wasn't long before the two brothers found themselves wandering aimlessly through the streets of Central with their two bodyguards, Maria Ross and Denny Brosh, in tow. Edward decided to take a stop at a nearby cafe. So, what do we do now, brother? Al asked as a plate of bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich, crepe-topped with whipped cream and syrup, and 2 coffee mugs were set before them. The Fullmetal Alchemist paused in his meal for a second to regard his younger brother. Al brought up a legitimate question. What were they supposed to do while they wait for copies of Dr. Marcos' notes? He glanced over to his brother to see that he had his head hung down, staring at his lap. Thanks to his armored helmet, Ed couldn't see Al's facial expression. However, Edward had gotten accustomed to Alphonse's moods over the years, and he could vaguely tell that his younger brother was feeling sad, woefully lugubrious. The blond boy had to bit his lip to keep himself from letting out an angry growl. Why did he have to bring up her? He was angry at himself for even mentioning her, but he was furious at his sister for leaving them. It's been 10 years. 10 fucking years, and they haven't even gotten a single letter from her. He would never forget the day she left, the day she ripped a hole in the family. After that day, nothing was the same anymore. From playing to eating, there was always this feeling of emptiness that just wouldn't go away, no matter how hard he tried to keep the rest of the family together. Edward couldn't never understand why. Why would she suddenly leave them like that? Didn't she know how much she hurt Al and made Mom suffer? Exclamation mark. Begrudgingly, Ed could admit there was a time where he absolutely loved and adored his older sister, Naruko. However, those feelings died the day she abandoned them. The burning anger, crushing sorrow, and utter disappointment he felt that day drilled a hole inside his heart that thundered ferociously along with the pain of betrayal he suffered because someone so close to him, that he had known his entire life would just abandon him as if all their time together meant nothing to her. The Fullmetal Alchemist became disillusioned of the fact that Naruko was a kind and caring older sister. He would never forgive her for walking out on them. He still remembered the days where Alphonse would cry non-stop. He even cried himself to sleep sometimes. The thought of it left a bitter taste in his mouth. Nobody messes with his little brother. Flashback. Mom. When is big sister coming back? Quote. Trisha winced at the depressive tone producing from her youngest son's mouth. She sported a smile as she turned to face her sons, who were sitting at the dining table waiting for dinner to be served. She tried to strong for them, no showing her inner turmoil. Al, your sister will come back someday, their mother reassured them. Well, when is someday? Edward exclaimed, angrily, but Trisha could sense the hurt in his voice. "She's not coming back, is she, Mom?" he voiced out, accusingly. "She doesn't care about us, she left us." The brown-haired woman let out a startled gasp at her elder son's accusation. "That's not true, Ed. Your sister loves us very much. Then why did she leave?" Quote. Trisha stood there frozen at Alphonse's question, unable to form words that would sat her children's hurt and anger. Her lips turned downward into a small frown. "Boys, listen. Your sister is special." Ed rose a disbelieving brow. "Special?" Quote. Trisha nodded her head slowly. "Your sister has a lot of responsibilities. But don't worry, she'd definitely come back one day. One day, when you boys are older, you'd understand." The brown-haired woman stood up from her kneeling position. "I'll better go get dinner." She headed into the kitchen and returned minutes later with bowls of ramen in her hand. "Oh, look at that. Guess, I made Naruko's favorite meal without even thinking." As she set the bowls down, Edward could see a silver of tear at the corner of his mother's eyelashes. Seeing that made his bite the inside of his lip in anger. He'd never forgive his sister for abandoning them. End of flashback. Ed closed his eyes at the bitter memories. "Brother." Al called his name in concern. The elder Elric sighed and shook his head. "It's nothing, Al. Come on, let's head to the library. Maybe we'll find something that would help us decode drive." Marcos notes. "We'd need all the information we can get on the Philosopher's Stone." Edward quickly paid for the meal, putting the money on the table, and dashed off without a second thought. "Hey! Wait for me, brother!" Alphonse called out, chasing after him. And here the two brothers were, in the library, looking for anything that might pertain to Dr. Marcos' research notes. Notes that haven't even looked at yet. But truthfully, Edward just wanted to go to the library to forget ever recalling his no-good sister in that stupid dream. Unfortunately, the exact opposite happened. He couldn't concentrate on the books he was trying to read. Instead his mind drifted towards his sister. No. He shouldn't be calling her that. The term, sister, became unbefitting of her the moment she walked out the door. His thoughts drifted towards Naruko. Memories of his time with her invaded his head like a plague. Ever since that dream, he couldn't stop dwelling on memories of his past. His past with her. Flashback. "What are you guys doing?" Naruko asked. She was in the middle of doing her chores when she found her brothers in their dad's study. She put the broom she was holding down, and looked over Ed's shoulder to see what he was reading. Eventually, her face scrunched up in confusion. "I don't understand this mumble-jumble, Datbeo. What is this?" she asked, plucking the book from Ed's hands. Edward pouted, annoyed. "Hey, give that back, sister." He snatched the book back. "And it's not mumble-jumble. It's alchemy." Quote. Sapphire eyes blinked in puzzlement. "Alchemy? What's that?" Quote. "Alchemy is a type of science, sister," Alphonse explained. Naruko rose a skeptical eyebrow. "Science? You guys want to be scientist?" She let out a snort. "Lame. Science is not lame," Ed yelled, indignantly. He looked offended at his elder sister's insult at his passion. "It's awesome. People have used science to create lots of amazing things." He then sent a glare towards Naruko, but she knew it was a playful, challenging one. "And what do you consider to be not lame?" Quote. The Uzumaki smirked, proudly, pointing a smug finger at herself. "Me, of course." Quote. Both Ed and Al gave her a look of disbelief. "Sister, sometimes your ego is bigger than your head," Edward sighed, shaking his head. Naruko frowned at that notion. "Oh, yeah." She charged at Edward, her hands going to his waist, tickling him to death. "Stop it, sister." Her younger brother cried between laughs. He was completely at her mercy. "Stop, sister, or I'll tell Mom," he threatened, but he didn't sound very convincing between all the laughter and all. "I won't stop, Ed," Naruko declared, evilly. "Not until you admit I'm awesome." Quote. "Never." Ed barely voiced out. He tried using his tiny hands to push his sister off of him, but to no avail. His sister was bigger and stronger than he was. "What's going on here?" Just then, Trisha came in through the door. Her curious green eyes gaze around the room to see books scattered across the floor as usual. "I heard Ed screaming from all down the hall." She looked upon her kids to see Alphonse giving her a sheepish smile while Edward and Naruko were engaged in a one-sided tickle fight. "Okay, that's enough, Naruko." Ed can't breath. Trisha gently lifted her eldest child off of her younger brother. Edward took lots of deep breaths, trying to refill his lungs with oxygen. "Thanks, Mom," he wheezed out, breathless. "Sister is evil. She tried to tickle me to death." Quote. Naruko childishly stuck her tongue out at him. "That's what you get for mocking me." Edward pouted, angrily, giving her a childlike glare in return. All right, that's enough you two. You shouldn't be fighting," Trisha scolded, lightly. "Naruko, return to your chores. Ed, Al, clean up your father's study." "Yes, Mom," all three kids said in unison, feeling guilty at being scolded. "What do you mean you're leaving?" Exclamation mark. Edward shouted at his sister, his tiny hands balled into angry fists. It was early morning, the day after Naruko tearfully announced her departure. Edward was full of doubt, confusion, and pain that he didn't say anything about her leaving when she first told him and Alphonse about it. In fact, he was in complete denial last night. He thought that he misheard or that his mind was playing tricks at him. There was no way his kind and loving older sister was abandoning him. Just no way. But the more and more he thought about it, the more fearful he became of his worst nightmare coming true. And that fear eventually turned into anger. Why? Exclamation mark. Why was she leaving them? What reason could there be? Or was it perhaps Naruko didn't like them anymore? When he got angry, Ed tended not to think straight. All thoughts of tact and logic were completely thrown out the window. He needed to confront his sister and demand her to tell him why she's leaving. Not to mention, she made Al cry. His younger brother was sobbing despairingly all last night. He cried all throughout the night until he tired himself out. It broke Ed's heart to see his brother in such sorrow and knowing that he was helpless. There was nothing he could say to cheer Al up, no words of comfort he could offer him. How could Edward even comfort him anyway when he was such disarray himself? Naruko was leaving them just like their father. His blood was boiling with rage, his body trembling with fury, and his heart was thumping violently with painstaking sadness. He had to confront his sister. Waiting this out any longer would drive him mad with grief. That's why the first thing that Edward did when he woke was look for Naruko. He eventually found her tended to their mother's garden. Without any form of plan, he marched right up to her, which led them to the situation they are currently. Edward, Naruko's face contorted into one of guilt at seeing the pain and anger in her younger brother's eyes. "Tell me why you're leaving." Ed demanded, teeth gritting so hard she could hear them crack. Naruko towards her disheartened gaze away from Edward's accusatory ones. Edward, that's something I can't tell you. She quickly elaborated her reasoning when she saw Ed's glower. Remember, Ed, when I told you that there are things people do because they hold something dear? She spoke, softly. Well, this is one of those moments. I'm leaving, but don't think I love you guys any less. You guys are very precious to me. One day, I'm sure you'd understand, Edward. And don't worry. I'll be back one day. She smiled, cheerfully. Edward's bangs shadowed the upper half of his face. Liar, he breathed, voice inaudible. You're a liar, Naruko. He yelled, glaring at his sister with such fury and hate that she took a step back in shock. If you really loved us, you wouldn't leave us. You made Al and Mom cry. You wouldn't have done that if you cared about us. Quote. Edward, Naruko uttered, voice filled with hurt. She reached out towards her little brother who flinched away from her as if her touch burned him. No. Go away. I'd never want to see you again. Quote. With that, Edward angrily stormed away, leaving Naruko alone in the garden. He didn't turn back to realize a single tear falling from his sister's face. End of flashback. And that's the last time I've spoke to her, Edward thought. His face was contorted into an angry scowl. She left about a week later, but during that time, Ed never spoke to his older sister again. How could he? She abandoned them just like him. It was few years after that his mom fell sick and died. Brother. Brother. Quote. Edward yelped, startled out of his musings. He stared up to see his armored younger brother leaning over him. Al. Don't scare me like that. Quote. Sorry, brother, but you were spacing out, Al explained. I've been standing here for the past 2 minutes calling you. What were you daydreaming about anyway? Quote. Ed climbed onto his feet. Nothing, Al, he said, dismissively. Alphonse put his hands on his hips, dubious about his brother's behavior. Is this about sister? He asked, his tone laced with seriousness and worry at his older brother's strange behavior. You miss her. I miss her, too, brother. I wonder what she's doing. Quote. Who cares about her? Exclamation mark. Edward hissed, vehemently. She ditched us, Al. If it wasn't for her, then Mom would still be alive now. Quote. Brother, calm down. The armored boy whispered back, frantically. No, Al. I would not calm down. The elder Elric refused. He started going off on tangent about what terrible sister they had. Alphonse had to quickly cover Edward's mouth when a few people started to glare at them when they went to investigate what was making all that racket. Sorry about that, Al apologized. Go back to your reading. He let out a sigh of relief when, after a few grumblings about annoying brats, the onlookers went back to their own business. Edward just huffed and bristly walked away. No use staying in the library any longer if he couldn't concentrate on what he was reading. Brother, wait up. Alphonse quickly rushed to catch up to him, his feet clanging against the wooden floor. He saw his brother freeze when he stepped outside the door. What's wrong, Ed? Quote. Edward's golden eyes were wide with shock and disbelief as he pointed a shaky finger over to where he was looking at. Alphonse trailed his brother's finger and he let out a stunned gasp at the scene. Not the actually scene, but who was in it. I'm sorry, ma'am, Maria spoke to the young blonde, blue-eyed woman in an authoritative manner. But if I don't know who you are, then I'm afraid we can't let you see Fullmetal. For all we know, you could be here to harm him. Naruko scoffed, throwing her hands on her hips. Oh, please. What is he? A child that needs to be babysitted and protected. Oh, right, she swiftly retracted her statement when the black-haired woman gave a dubious look. She forgot that Ed should only be 15 by now, and, according to this country, that was still considered being a child. She herself is just legal enough to be called an adult here, being 18 and all. It's much different than in the elemental nations. As soon as she put on her leaf headband, she was practically considered an adult in most people's eyes. She could already do whatever she wanted, except, you know, doing actual adult things. There was difference between being treated like an adult and actually being an adult. And in the Warring States era, as soon as kids were trained decently enough, they were considered an adult by the age of 6 and sent off to the battlefield to fight in an endless war. No wonder the life expectancy of that time period was barely 30. This country was different, so much different. Naruko opened her mouth to convince the woman to let her see her younger brothers. After all, Hinako told her they would most likely be in the library, and that, thanks to Sage Mode, which she activated and dispelled earlier, she could feel their presence in the building. She didn't get the chance to though when a couple of frantic voices cut her off. Sister. Her blue eyes widened slightly as she trailed her gaze up the top of the steps. Her initial shock disappeared and she let out a bright smile. Yo, Ed, Al. Long time no see.
Unfortunately, this part is over. I hope you enjoyed it. My apologies for all those quotes. Please have a good morning, afternoon, evening, or night. See you next time, my dear faves.